panel discussion emas, bu ikki faoliyat o'xshash vaqt bo'ldi. Mana bu birinchi faoliyat, yana bir faoliyat o'xshash vaqt bo'ldi. Şoňa
Hürmetlik hanımlar, efendiler, Xalqaro Uyghur Munbiri parlament a'zolari uchrashishi boshlandi.
ご来場の皆様、ただいまより国際ウイグルフォーラム各国国会議員間の国際会議を始めます。
Ladies and gentlemen, the session at the International Uyghur Forum Global Parliamentarian Convention is now starting.
the requests of the Chinese embassy to stop Dalkun from taking the floor. So that is kind of what brought me here and to focus on this issue, and I think it's a perfect example of how you guys were right. This is not just about what's happening in China. This is what is happening to all of us, and I think if we look around this room, probably 99% of you have similar stories to share. So again, I commend you for being here, and I'm really grateful to the Japanese Diet for hosting this important event. And with that, Dr. David Tobin, for your opening remarks. And I know we kind of dissent on the national security threat, but we'll get to that.
That's fine. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, everyone. Yeah, I mean, I would define transnational repression as the attempt of any state to interfere in the rights to free speech, association and assembly of people in another state. Simple as that. So I don't include political assassinations, consider that political violence. I don't include buying out of democratic officials, that's interference. Clear interference in sovereignty, clear national security issues, but many of the things we call transnational repression and many of the experiences of Uyghurs every single day are forms of transnational repression that go unnoticed because they're human rights issues and not necessarily national security issues. So most of the work I have done on the issue is trying to convince security practitioners to take these issues seriously, because they often do not. But they have to think in the long term, not the short term. The most obvious being family separation and harassment. That many security practitioners are concerned about in terms of values, but in terms of their job, in terms of security, it's not what they focus on. So one of the main points I want to make today is we need a realist approach, a more realistic approach to Uyghur human rights that takes very seriously the different interests of states, different material interests. One of the reasons forced labour is such a hot topic and there's so much movement is because it is in the material interests of large economies to stop it. But it's very, very hard to convince Kazakhstan or Turkey to act on those issues. It's very, very difficult to convince a medium-sized power that wants investment from China that acting on forced labour is in their interests, because often they do not see it that way. So we often have to look at where security and rights diverge and converge. Where there's a convergence, we can convince people to act, but when there's a divergence, we need to look at different tactics and different constituencies. We need to remember that human rights exist to protect people from states. That's why the concept was invented after 1945. It's different from older traditions of liberal natural rights, rights given by God. Human rights largely is a narrative created after 1945 to protect people from states when they have too much arbitrary power. So we can't always rely on the state to protect us and our human rights, but we also need the state. So it's a paradox. It's just the way the world works. It's a tension between sovereignty and rights of the people. We just need to live with that. There's many benefits and drawbacks from securitization. And by that, I do not mean the addition of security services, police, military, etc. I mean framing something as a security issue. When we securitize an issue, we get increased attention and momentum because powerful actors become involved and want to act. So there creates an initial burst of momentum, but there can also be less control and less focus on human rights, the types of issues that we want to talk about today. For example, the notion of human security in the 1990s, framing the environment and migration as security issues, created massive amounts of momentum, but then we have inertia when we see that certain issues will not affect specific states. The environment being an obvious one, where we see climate change, where we have mapping and predictions about which parts of land will be underwater and which will not. So when we're working on human rights, I would argue we really need to think about a security practitioner's mindset and be realistic about that. What a security practitioner does, what their job is, they can, and what they do. And essentially, security is there and states exist to protect citizens within that state. That's just a realistic approach. This is simply something that states need to do and should do. They should look after their own citizens first. So NGOs and human rights practitioners have to convince them to look after human rights as well. Now, The Transnational Repression project that myself and Narola Elama conducted in the United Kingdom, Turkey and Thailand, we really found that many of the issues of transnational repression were not reaching new heights, were not simply escalating further and further, but we were seeing new tactics. People that interviewed about their experiences 2016 to 2020 really talked about direct threats, threats to their family, etc. Threats of violence to their family if they do not end their advocacy was the most obvious one. But by 2022, 23, most people had been tracked by the party state. The party state had already decided who was trustworthy and who was not. So, for example, people who had been in prison in China were not asked to conduct surveillance of their own community. People who had said, no, I will not end my advocacy, whatever you do, were no longer being harassed, they're no longer receiving threats, but they were under surveillance. So the tactics really had shifted from tracking who is trustworthy, threatening people to change their behaviour, to now simply monitoring people who had not played ball, who had refused to participate, and treating ordinary people as threats, monitoring their everyday behaviour, where they go, who they talk to, what they talk about. That was a key tactic. So some of the biggest issues we looked at and found by talking to Uyghurs, asking them what affects your life, what do you want done, were not always national security issues. Some of them were, but some issues like statelessness. Obviously, the threat of deportation was the biggest issue. People living on temporary visas, temporary residence permits, that were frightened that when they expired, they would be sent back to China, and we know what would happen then. Issues of collaboration with police, with local officials, informal pressure, not necessarily extradition treaties, formal security arrangements, but murky actions by perhaps police, but often by plainclothes police, unclear actors. But the surveillance methods had clearly frightened the community, where people, ordinary Uyghurs, were being asked to take photographs of other Uyghurs. That's a huge impact on the community, where the people we interviewed, particularly in Turkey, were frightened of their own people. In the UK, we interviewed people who would not speak to another Uyghur. They only wanted to speak to me, and they kept their story within that framework, even asking people, do you want to be introduced to the Uyghur community? Some people were too scared. It's paranoia, but sometimes it can be justified. But that surveillance method is a method by the party state to create paranoia in a community and to prevent people from interacting safely. Notably, all those experiences were heightened for those who speak out against China, particularly in Turkey. Those who had spoken out against China, spoken to the BBC, or advocated, were under most pressure and frightened for what would happen when their visas expire. We know the core tactic of China's transnational repression is somewhat different from, say, Russia. Now, most of the literature on the subject in academia likes the concept of authoritarian transnational repression. There's some things in common, but what's different about China and Russia, as it has been for some time, is China's party state is more focused on ideology. It's always been obsessed with how people think in everyday behaviour to ensure loyalty and obedience. So the family separation and hostage-taking tactic, that's something quite unique to China. It happens in some cases across the world, in different states, but what we've found in the Uyghur community is that this is affecting everyone. It's ordinary people, it's not high-level targets, it's not dissidents, it's not political actors, it's just any Uyghur at all. It's an attempt to break their roots, in Chen Chuangguo's words. Policymakers tell me that's an issue we can't do anything about. It's not illegal to phone a Uyghur and tell them, if you don't stop your advocacy, there will be trouble with your family, or to show pictures of their family and give implicit threats. So we found policymakers in the UK, security practitioners, care very much about that issue, but they don't know what to do. They do not know what law this breaks. They do not know where to go with it. When people would phone the police in the United Kingdom, the police would say similar things. We do not know what to do about that unless you have evidence of being directly threatened inside the United Kingdom. We're not sure what to do. We can take some notes, but we just don't know. Most people we interviewed would highlight the key thing that would make them safe is the Canadian quota system. In Turkey, everyone asked, how do we get to Canada? That's what would make them safe. Having a state say, you're safe here. We made it quite clear in our recommendations, it's not about numbers, though Canada should be commended for what it has done there, but the Uyghur community was telling us the one thing that would keep us safe is official endorsement that we would be safe here. Another state saying with an official stamp, here are your rights, we will protect them, and you phone this number to tell the security services when these rights are violated. That was the number one concern. But of course, gaining movement on migration is very difficult. It's not a popular topic. It's a politically divisive topic. Gaining movement on that in Parliament in the UK or in Congress is extremely complicated. So to conclude, really, we do need to think about how to avoid inertia in this topic, particularly in transnational repression, but in Uyghur human rights generally. We need to learn how to appeal to both national security interests to gain that high-level interest and action, but also human rights to highlight those issues that are considered too small, too everyday for ordinary practitioners who don't necessarily see the long-term picture. As Laura said, a threat to someone's rights today is a massive threat to us all tomorrow. But that isn't necessarily how policymakers think. They're focused on here and now, what can I do now? Whereas as a scholar, I can see the implications of allowing China to shape global norms, for example, the UN, creating a system where arbitrary detention becomes normalized. That's a massive threat to world order, but it's not necessarily a threat today. It's a long time away that people don't necessarily focus on. We need to learn to appeal to different political constituencies. One thing I'd commend Canada for in the M62 bill is, of course, Liberals and Conservatives work together in a non-partisan manner on issues of national security and human rights, and they got the job done. That's where it works, when we find those different constituencies that can work together and use their position to leverage against China. We also need to win public opinion. There is considerable inertia on the topic in public opinion. We need to make it in policymakers' interests to act. And by doing that, we need to make it an election issue. We need to make sure constituents, as Alexis said yesterday, actually know about this topic and want their MPs to act on it. That's what will make an MP act. It's not all about values. I would like to think that MPs will act on values, but often they don't, and often they can't. They often have to look after their own constituents and meet their demands. That's their job. And lastly, what Rabbi Cooper said yesterday about needing individual stories is very important. We need to show the everyday experiences of relatable people. This is how you win over public opinion. It might not win over security practitioners, but that is what people will be changed on and will act on. One example, and there's many examples, but an obvious one being when Gulbahar Haiti Waji's daughter came to talk on her behalf in my hometown Glasgow. She showed up to give a talk to 50 people who knew nothing about the subject, almost nothing. It was a book festival, people just sort of semi-interested in China. She showed up as an ordinary person. She had shopping bags. She was talking about how she loved the city and had a great time. Immediately, she got people's attention. People listened because she wasn't talking about high politics, security issues. She was there just saying, hey, I'm an ordinary person. I didn't ask for this. The reason I am being repressed, the reason I'm being attacked is because I am Uyghur. And that is what won the audience over. And that is what we need to emphasize in this issue, that Uyghurs are being tracked, monitored, and attacked, not because they've done something or because they're politically active, but because they're Uyghur. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and some very good points to get back to later. Now, I'll be giving the floor to Azim Ibrahim, Senior Director at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. Now, I know you have some very interesting things in the works on transnational repression, so be very keen to hear about that, obviously. And if maybe you could also talk about some of the lessons that you've learned from the previous work you did on really putting the Uyghur genocide on the map, if you will. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Laura, for that introduction. And honourable members, distinguished guests, great honour for me to be here. So let me just give you a very quick overview in terms of why I'm actually sitting here. In March 2021, my institute, the New Lines Institute, undertook the most comprehensive study at that time on whether China had breached the Genocide Convention in its persecution of the Uyghurs. We compiled a team of 55 leading legal scholars from around the globe to examine the evidence. These included former ICJ judges, prosecutors, former ambassadors, former chair of war crimes tribunals, etc. And the conclusion they came to was very clear that China was in clear breach of the Genocide Convention. And since that time, my institution has been looking to examine what further can we do on the Uyghur issue. And the most common thing that came up was always on the Uyghur Sanctions Act, the Forced Labour Sanctions Act. And that was always a very complicated issue. It was always difficult to kind of get your head around it and even find scholars that kind of really understand the depth of it. But most recently, with my interaction with various congressional committees, one of the things that transpired is that Congress is going to be focusing quite heavily now on the issue of transnational repression. And so based on that, being part of a think tank, we want to get ahead of the curve. I've decided to create a transnational repression working group. This will be a group of scholars from across the globe who are going to examine the issue of transnational repression. Now, the first thing I realised that we have to do on this issue of transnational repression is to actually create a working definition, because there is no actual universally accepted definition. Every institution has its own understanding of what transnational repression is, and this creates huge complications. The FBI has its definition, Freedom House has its definition, other governments have their own definition, and they all chop and change whenever they want, when it fits their agenda. So you say, well, look, this constitutes transnational repression in Canada, what's happened recently, and they'll push back and say, well, no, that's not actually transnational repression. That's just legitimate lobbying that every country does. Yes, okay, they're a bit aggressive, the CCP, but that's all legitimate. So we have to create a definition. So this is my first task, is that we've put together a team of scholars looking at this. We're going to create a very sharp definition. Many of you are actually part of this. It's good to see all of you. And we are going to then kind of socialize it and then try to get this traction. Because transnational repression, ladies and gentlemen, is not actually illegal under any national or international law. So the actual violations, individual violations, may constitute rights violations or crimes in themselves. But as a phenomena, transnational repression is not illegal. And it comes in many forms. Of course, assassinations, renditions are the ones that get the headlines. But the real transnational repression, which really grinds people down, is a much lower level intensity stuff. So stuff like stalking, surveilling, digital intimidation, and defamation, defaming somebody online. Now, if you went to the police with any of this stuff, you know, most of them will have absolutely no idea what to do. Or somebody is defaming me on Twitter. They made this story up about me. Or somebody is stalking me. I'm getting digitally intimidated, members of my family. They really wouldn't know what to do. This is why you need a definition as the first step in order to make this to put this on the agenda of policymakers. And of course, it is not just persons, individual persons that are targeted. It's also institutions. So you have communication systems, educational establishments. You hear from many of the people here how your universities are being targeted. And you also have democratic institutions in their entirety, as we have seen in Canada and elsewhere. And this is on the increase because states are actually learning from each other in terms of how to do this. How do we project influence into another state? You know, in the past, it was possible that people fleeing from oppressive states would find, you know, sanctuary somewhere else, that they'd have a life relatively free from harassment. If you essentially became apolitical as a dissident, then, you know, more or less you could have a life relatively free. But the whole purpose of transnational repression is to indicate to everybody that there is no sanctuary for you, that you cannot essentially, you can, even in a democratic free society, you will not be able to practice your rights. And this leads to depression and exhaustion amongst the dissidents. Now, China is pioneering many of these techniques, and they're exporting them. They're exporting them around the globe, and many institutions, even within our own democratic countries, are falling into line when it comes to this stuff, and much of it inadvertently. They don't realise they're silencing employees, telling them not to tweet or talk about social media, about free Tibet, you know, stand with Hong Kong. All of this is exportation of Chinese values. You know, when we brought first China into the World Trade Organization, if you remember, Bill Clinton said, you know, when we open China up, China thinks it can censor the internet. That's like nailing Jello to the wall, and they all had a good laugh. But the fact is, China is essentially censoring the internet, and they are exporting their values across the globe, which is something that we thought that they will open up to us and they'll become more like us, but it's actually the other way around. And of course, none of this is new. You know, we have seen this in the past. You know, Gaddafi had a whole campaign of what he called the stray dogs. Stalin murdered Trotsky in Mexico, and you had Iran, a whole wave of assassinations in the 1980s. You know, so none of this is new, but what's different this time round is essentially what I believe is why policymakers are interested in this issue more than any other, is because it violates state sovereignty. It violates state sovereignty, and this is something policymakers do not like. You know, we've always had we have a general understanding of the Westphalian system that all states are sovereign, and when this undermines the national sovereignty of a state, it does not go down very well. And I'll just finish off by making 3 points in terms of why transnational repression is different today than it was in the past. First of all, much of this has been supercharged by technology. You know, technology was in the past, it was used by dissidents to communicate, to get their message out. So you had exiles living in London, you had exiles living in Paris. They could communicate with a mass of people in Iran, in Saudi Arabia and China. That technology has now been turned on its head. It's now the other way around. Now you can target individual dissidents. You can target using the same technology. And this research shows that 31% of the transnational repression digitally comes from the CCP globally. And this is because the CCP, China, has very unique technological capabilities. The app WeChat, for example, is indispensable, and that is essentially a mechanism by which they can track and control everybody. And I can talk about TikTok and others as well. So that's the first thing. Transnational repression has been supercharged by technology. Technology, which at one point used to favour the dissidents, has now been reversed. The second thing is the war on terror. Terrorist extremists. This is the only label you need to basically target somebody, whether it's an Interpol red notice or something. And it's no surprise that 78% of people that are targeted by transnational repression are Muslims. Because once you target a Muslim and you say, well, look, this person is an extremist, this Uyghur is an extremist, or he's a potential terrorist, the reaction is always, there must be something there. You know, that we have to be cautious. And so it's always easy to target the Muslims, and Muslims are therefore much more vulnerable. The third point is that why is this different now? Now, who is the actual victim of transnational repression? And I would argue, obviously, many of you will say it's the Uyghurs, it's the dissidents, etc. But I would actually like to expand that. You know, most recently, I'll give you a very quick story. You know, I was in Boston very recently, just this year, and I've been going on a book tour of my latest book, Authoritarian Century. And I've been speaking to Fortune 500 companies, law firms, etc. And the book essentially looks at the global trends over the next 40 years. Now, authoritarianism is on the rise, democracy is in decline. And so I was invited to one of the largest oil companies in the world, the board of directors, to come and speak to them. So I went to Boston, I was speaking to them. There were 8 nationals from Beijing in the audience, 8. And so they weren't Chinese Americans, they were just Chinese, they actually came in from Beijing. And I gave my speech and everything else. At the end of it, there was silence. And then this lady stood up from China, and she started shouting at me, saying, look, what you are saying is complete lies. None of this is true. China has no interest in Taiwan. Taiwan are our brothers, etc., etc. She stood up. As soon as she stood up, all the other Chinese nationals stood up and lined up behind her at the mic. Yeah, and the moderator had to step in and say, look, we need to kind of calm down everybody, etc., etc., yeah? Now, the interesting thing about that is that I spoke to the CEO of the oil company later, and he told me, he said, look, he goes, none of these people actually believe that stuff. We know them. We've known they're our colleagues for years. But the local consulate will get a report. The Beijing consulate will now get a report of you having come here and spoken. And then all of these people will be asked, what did you do? Yeah, what did you do when he came up and he started talking about Beijing and about the rise of authoritarianism, the Belt and Road Initiative, etc. So once the lady stood up, then all the others had to stand up as well. So I would argue that they are also victims of transnational repression because silence is no longer an option. You cannot be neutral in this situation. You have to show loyalty at all times to the regime, even if you are overseas. And if you are not, it will be reported back. And so this loyalty to the leader, you know, one could argue that is also a form of transnational repression. I used to teach at the University of Chicago, and I remember half of my class used to be Chinese students. And in the class, they would never speak up. You know, they wouldn't. But then I would meet them all one by one for their assignments, and that's when they'll kind of speak up openly. Because, you know, and they actually tell you openly that, look, if I say anything in the class, it gets reported back. I can't trust anybody, any other Chinese citizens. And so I would argue that in itself is a form of transnational repression, and which is unprecedented. There is no longer an option for anybody to be silent. You have to show continuous, regular, measurable loyalty to the leader, to the regime, to the government. Otherwise, you will be called up saying, look, why aren't you standing up? And then they'll get into the same trouble as those dissidents. And with that, I'll finish off and pass it back to the chair.
Yes, thank you, Azim. And I think some very strong similarities in what David said previously about the importance of ideology for Beijing, which is very different from the transnational repression we see coming from other places, and the loyalty reference you made. It reminds me of something, a quote, Bethany Allen Ibrahimian, that I'm sure you all know, who writes for Axios, told me a couple of weeks ago, and I think she hit it right when she said, you know, we basically now see Beijing trying to impose the same system of control, absolute control it has at home, domestically, around the world, and I think she's correct in saying that. Now, you also talked about, you know, silence is no longer an option, and with that, I'd like to move on to Mr. Muhammed Naci Chinisli, who's a member of the Turkish Parliament. Now, Naci, Turkey obviously is home to a very large, if not the largest, Uyghur diaspora overseas. There's very clear and very strong cultural, historic, linguistic links between your people. But despite all that, many today do not feel safe in Turkey or in other Muslim countries, and I think very often they feel quite abandoned by their Muslim brothers and sisters in other countries. And allow me also to make a specific reference in that case to the case of Idris Hassan, who is a Uyghur human rights defender who unfortunately is not here today because for the past 2.5 years now he has been in a prison cell in solitary confinement in Morocco after he fled from Turkey because he was no longer feeling safe in Turkey, got caught on a red notice, abusive Interpol red notice in Morocco, and has languished in jail there since then. So he's a very real example of when perceived fear, the risk of persecution, of control from the Chinese state overseas in another country leads people to end up in even worse and unsafe situations. So on that, Mr. Chinisli, why isn't Turkey doing more to speak up for their Uyghur brothers and sisters?
Thank you, Chair. It's a difficult question for me because principally I do not criticize my country out of my country, but this is a true question, unfortunately. At the beginning of my speech, I would like to express that I was not aware of the topics of this panel, That's why I have prepared another speech, but this is a very difficult and important question. I think the reasons are economical and also political. We would like our government to be more engaged in this issue internationally, but unfortunately they reject it. And in Turkey, Uyghur issue is very popular, and we are talking about this enough much, I think. And China has a big influence all over the world, economically, financially. China's influence in Turkey, financial influence in Turkey, is not so much as estimated, actually. And despite of this, I don't understand why Turkish government does not react more than which is doing now. But I have some objections to David. I don't agree with David what he has said about Turkey, because you said that the people are frightened when they talk about China or when they are talking each other. It is not so bad, actually. You cannot compare my country with Russia and China. We have still a democracy in Turkey. It is not ideal, maybe, but we have a democracy in Turkey. I'm a politician from opposition, and I make very harsh and hard critics in the parliament against the government. You can say that the government prefers to be autocratic. They prefer autocratic ways to make politics. But it doesn't mean that our state and our country and our nation is autocrat as well. We have still a democracy, we have elections, we have two alliances in Turkey because of the new presidential system. And our alliance had 49% votes, and we have lost the election, unfortunately. But we try to win the election at the next election. We are working hard. And now I am here in Japan, and I'm talking about the Uyghur issue, and nobody is following me, what I'm saying, what I'm talking about is, we don't have frightens. We are not afraid for talking. No, it is not true. If you don't mind, I would like to make my speech, and thank you very much for this opportunity, honorable members of parliaments, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the Speaker of the House of Representatives of Japanese Parliament for letting us to have our forum in this significant place. To convey you, I have brought the sincere regards and greetings of our party chairwoman, Ms. Meral Akşener, and of many, many friends from Turkey. I have to express my appreciation to Japan Uyghur Parliamentary League for investigating and taking action on human rights violations by China, World Uyghur Congress, Japan Uyghur Association, and Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China for organizing International Uyghur Forum. Thank you for the opportunity given to me. Thank you for the invitation as well. We are gathering here to be the voice of the Uyghur Turks. It is a huge pleasure and satisfaction for me to be able to make a little contribution to my Uyghur sisters and brothers. In East Turkestan, China Uyghur Autonomous Region, Uyghur Turks have been persecuted and tortured for decades. They are struggling for survival. Their population has not increased, but rather declined due to the deliberate atrocities they have suffered for decades. Uyghur issue has recently entered the top of the world agenda. However, it has been in my life for almost 50 years. I heard the words torture, massacre, genocide for the first time in my life, and from a very, very honorable person, it was Mr. Isa Yusuf Alptekin, who was the General Secretary of East Turkestan government in 1947 and who was the most frequent guest of honor of my family in Istanbul. Therefore, I would like to mention my sincere thoughts about the great tragedy and gross human rights violations of the Uyghur Turks in East Turkestan. Uyghur Turks, our brothers and sisters, are being separated from their wives, husbands, siblings, children and families, and forced to live their traditions, customs, culture, and religious beliefs with cruel methods under the so-called education programs which are organized by Chinese authorities. This kind of atrocity has to be voiced loudly, not to remain hidden in China Uyghur Autonomous Region, and it has been brought to the world agenda. To be a voice for their sufferings is our human and national debt of Turkey and Turkish people as well. According to us, the issue of Uyghur Turks must be handled with sensitivity and dignity at national and international level. Turkey must maintain diplomatic relations with China to protect our Uyghur cognates in East Turkestan by observing the balances between the two countries with the state seriousness, because the states like Turkey must see the future but not forget the past. Insistence and struggle that have been pursuing have come up with results in course of time. Today, thankfully, the tragedy of our Uyghur Turkic brothers and sisters in East Turkestan is on the agenda of both Turkey and the world, and international community recognizes the practices that Uyghurs are subjected to as gross violations of human rights. If Isa Yusuf Alptekin were alive, he would be proud to see the first stage of his goal realized, at least in the international public opinion. The issue has been already at the agenda of the international community. We need to ensure that these international efforts and developments can help to address the heart of the problem itself, which is the elimination of the harsh conditions in the camps in China Uyghur Autonomous Region. So far, unfortunately, all these efforts of different countries around the world have not been able to heal the wounds of our Uyghur Turks who are being persecuted there. My call to all Chinese authorities is that our Uyghur cognates must live humanely and their rights must be seen as their own citizens. As E-Party from the Turkish Parliament, we are seeing our Uyghur brothers and sisters in East Turkestan like the same as our Turkish brothers and sisters in Azerbaijan, as our brothers and sisters in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, as our brothers and sisters in different countries of Central Asia, as well as our brothers and sisters of Turkish citizens to have settled in Europe and America for the last 3 generations. It is the most natural right of Muslims and Turks to be able to live with their heads held high and with honor as Muslims and Turks, just like people of all other races and religions all over the world. As conclusion, I would like to express with honor that when I was the member of NATO Parliamentary Assembly from 2018 to 2023, the atrocity and genocide in East Turkestan have taken place in 2 paragraphs in the China report with my efforts. I will not be too modest for this. I am very thankful to all my colleagues from that time at NATO Parliamentary Assembly from different countries, from NATO countries. At the end of my words, I greet you with my respect. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Nachi. We'll now move on to Mr. Selçuk Özdak. member of the Turkish Parliament and Vice Chairman of the Future Party. Mr. Özdag, if I may, I'd like to ask you a similar question. What can Turkey do more for the Uyghur people, and how can we make sure that Uyghurs inside Turkey feel safe to speak up and to live their lives? Thank you.
Teşekkür ederim. Öncelikle Dolkun İsa'ya teşekkür ediyorum. Dünya Uygur Vakfı Başkanı'na bir davayı, bir fikri, bir haklı davayı yaşattığı için.
First of all, I would like to thank Dolkun İsa for leading and carrying out this just cause.
Japon hükümetine ve aynı zamanda Japon parlamentosunun İnsan Hakları İnceleme Komisyonu'na çok teşekkür ediyorum. Böyle hassas bir konuyu dünyanın gündemindeyken Japonya'da tekrar yeniden gündeme aldıkları için.
I also would like to thank the Japanese government and the parliament and the Human Rights Committee for bringing this very critical issue to the attention of the world.
Dünyanın gündeminde olan böyle bir konu için dünyanın her yerinden gelen akademisyenlere ve siyasetçilere teşekkür ediyorum.
I also thank the academicians as well as the politicians coming from different parts of the world.
Bir teşekkür de Çekya Cumhuriyeti'ne. 2 yıl önce 7. Dünya Uygur Kongresi'nde herkes susarken Prag'da böyle bir kongre yaptıkları için Çek hükümetine, özellikle Prag Belediye Başkanı'na teşekkür ediyorum.
I also would like to thank Czechia as well as the president of the Council of the Prague, mayor of the Prague, at a time when the world was mainly silent about this very important issue.
Ben tarihçiyim, siyasetçi olmakla beraber mesleğim tarihçilik. Geçmişe götüreyim sizleri. 751 yılına Kırgızistan'da Talas Nehri kenarında Talas Savaşı yapıldı.
I am a politician, but I am also a historian by profession. I would like to take you back to history for a while. In the year 751, a war called Talas War took place near in Kyrgyzstan.
Türklerle Çinliler çok savaştılar Orta Asya'da.
Turks and Chinese had wars for long periods of years.
Bu savaşta Araplarla savaşıyordu Çinliler.
In this war was going on between the Arabs and the Chinese.
Türkler Arapları tuttu.
Turks supported the Arabs.
Neden? Çünkü Çinlilerden çok çekmiştik. Tekrar Çin Seddi'nin arkasına göndermek istedik onları.
Because the reason is that Turks had a lot of problems with the Chinese, and we wanted the Chinese to go within their own borders.
Ve kazandı Araplar, Türkler gönderdik geri Çin Seddi'nin arkasına. Dünyayı da yaklaşık 1280 yıl, 1300 yıl bir noktada Çinlilerden kurtardık.
And the war, the Talas War was won, and the Chinese had to retreat to their own within their own borders, and by the result of this war, we were able to save the world, protect the world for about 1300 years.
Sonra 21. yüzyıl geldi ve ticaret alanında Çin hem emek gücünü istismar etti hem de dünyadaki geri kalmış ülkeleri istismar etti.
When we came to the 21st century, the economics and commerce became in the forefront of the world, and China abused the labor as well as the third world countries in the world.
Ben çocukluğumdan itibaren Türk dünyasıyla ilgileniyorum. 60 senedir.
I have been dealing with the Turkish world for the last 60 years of my life.
Türkistan adı Kazakistan, Kırgızistan, Özbekistan, Doğu Türkistan değildi, Türkistan'dı adı. Sonra Rusya'da bir rejim değişikliği oldu, buralar işgal edildi.
Initially, there was no Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, East Turkestan and all that. There was one Turkestan, and after a war between Russia, this part of the geography was divided into several portions.
İnsan yaratılışına uygun olmayan bir rejim, komünizm geldi.
Communism, which is totally against the creation of the human beings, came into place.
Sonra yıkıldılar, 70 yıl kaldı Rusya, komünist rejim. Türk dünyası bir noktada bağımsız oldu.
After 70 years of communism, it was disintegrated, and Turkish countries became independent.
Sonra Mao Çin'de devrim yaptı, Doğu Türkistan'ı işgal etti.
Mao made a revolution in China and invaded East Turkestan.
İnsan hakları ihlalleri başladı.
And human rights abuses started.
Sonraları bu rejim güçlendi ve şu an kapalı bir rejim olarak özellikle Uygurlarla uğraşıyor, Uygur Türkleriyle uğraşıyor, Müslümanlarla uğraşıyor.
This regime, as the time went by, this regime became powerful, and it started to abusing the Muslim and Turkic populations in its own population.
Hem Uygur Türkleri için tehlikeli bu yapı, hem de dünya için tehlikeli, dünya için tehlikeli.
This system is dangerous for both the Uyghurs themselves as well as the whole world itself.
Türkiye'de güzel bir söz vardır. Susma, sustukça sıra sana gelecek derler.
There's a saying in Turkish, don't keep silent. If you keep silent, you will be the next.
O zaman kim konuşacak? Hem Uygur Türkleri konuşacak Çin'de ve Çin'in dışında diasporalarıyla, lobileriyle konuşacaklar.
So this means we all need to speak up, including the Uyghurs who are in diaspora, and if possible the Uyghurs within the East Turkestan.
Hem İslam dünyası, yani Türkler ve Müslümanlar konuşacaklar, başka Müslüman ülkeler konuşacaklar.
Also the Islamic world also needs to speak up about this issue.
Hem de Batı dünyası insan haklarına önem veren, bir noktada yaşadıklarıyla geldikleri nokta arasında insan haklarına önem veren ülkeler konuşacak.
Of course, in addition to that, Western countries who value human rights and democracy need to speak up.
Yoksa sıra Uygur Türklerine geldiği gibi aynı zamanda Çin'in ekonomik gücü Batı dünyasındaki insan haklarını da ihlal edecek, tehdit edecek.
Unless this happens, the economic power of China will in the future threaten the human rights even in the West.
O zaman iki görevimiz var. Bütün Çin'in karşısında olan, insan haklarından yana olan ülkelerin ve insanların, sivil toplum kuruluşlarının iki görevi var. Birincisi, insan hakları ihlallerini bütün dünyaya doğru takdim etmek. Çin'de yapılan insan hakları ihlallerini bütün dünyaya doğru takdim etmek.
In this case, the people in the world who are valuing the human rights as well as NGOs and the governments need to unite and work together, and we should first of all make the world about the human rights abuses in real terms as to what is really happening in that part of the world.
Emek sömürüsüyle elde ettikleri kazançla, büyüklükle ilgili mutlaka bunlara karşı bir ambargo uygulanması gerekmektedir bütün dünya tarafından.
In my opinion, an embargo sanction must be applied to China because of the abuse of the labor.
Japon hükümetinin veya başka hükümetlerin yaptıklarını takdir ediyoruz.
I appreciate the things done by the Japanese government as well as other governments,
Yeterli değil.
but this is not sufficient.
Daha fazla ambargo, daha fazla insan hakları konusunda duyarlı hale getirmek gerekiyor Çin'i.
We need to work on to make the world more aware of the human rights abuses issues as well as like stronger sanctions.
Burada sebepler söylendi. Konuşmacılar sebepleri söylediler. Teşhisleri söylemeye çalıştılar. Önemli olan tedavi, teşhis, tespit doğru ama tedavi önemli.
Here during this panel discussion we talked about the issues and the diagnosis, but we need to talk about the treatment side of it as well.
Kaynak Çin'dir. Bu problemlerin kaynağı Çin'dir. Yoksa başka ülkelerdeki bireysel olarak insan hakları ihlalleri, Uygurların yaşadıkları, özgürlüklerinin tahdit edilmesi, kısıtlanması veya tehditler veya ölümler veya korkutulmalar, bunun tamamının kaynağı Çin'dir. Merkezi Çin'dir, Pekin'dir.
The source of the whole issue, the whole problem is China itself. In other countries, maybe like issues related to the Uyghur issue may be happening outside China itself, but China itself is the source.
Özgür ülkelerde, yani Batı dünyasında, Japonya'da, Amerika'da, Kanada'da, Avustralya'da yapabildiklerini kendi ülkelerinde kim bilir neler yapıyorlardır. Yapabildiklerine kendi ülkelerinde Uygur Türklerine veya başkalarına kim bilir neler yapıyorlardır. Bilmiyoruz neler yaptıklarını. Çünkü Çin kapalı bir rejim. Kapalı bir ülke.
Because China is a closed regime, we don't know in Australia, in Canada or outside China itself, we don't exactly know what is happening.
Ve Türkiye'de Çin'e sesleniyoruz. Çok konuştuk. Çin Büyükelçisi'nden randevu istedik, vermedi. Ama bazı partilere karşı Türkiye'de çok daha yakın ilişkiler içerisindeler, onlara randevu veriyorlar. Onlarla konuşuyorlar saatlerce ama bize, Gelecek Partisi'ne, eski Başbakan Ahmet Davutoğlu'nun partisine, ben de onun yardımcılığı yaptım, bize randevu vermiyorlar.
In Turkey, we are raising our voice to China, and for example, we asked the ambassador, the embassy of China, to give us an appointment to talk about this issue, but they refused that. They refused this to the president of the Future Party and myself.
Neden? Çünkü Ahmet Davutoğlu başbakan ve ben de onun yardımcısıyken Doğu Türkistan'dan kaçan, başka ülkelere, Malezya dahil giden kişilerden yaklaşık 7-8 bin kişiyi çeşitli kimliklerle Türkiye'ye taşıdık, Batı dünyasına taşıdık ve Çin'in baskılarına boyun eğmedik.
The main reason is behind this is that when Mr. Davutoglu was the prime minister and I was the deputy prime minister, about 7,000 to 8,000 Uyghurs were accepted, settled in Turkey, some of whom went to other countries later.
Çin'le kavga etmeyelim, dövüşmeyelim ama diplomasiyle bu işler halledilebilir.
We don't want any fight or anything like that at all with China. All we want is to bring a solution to those issues by negotiations.
Batı dünyası, Amerika Birleşik Devletleri ve Batı dünyası bu konuyu istismar ediyor, kendi çıkarları için kullanıyor iddiası var.
There's a people argue that West and the United States is abusing the Uyghur issue for their own interests.
Bunu Çin söylüyor.
This is something China is saying.
O zaman açın kapıları, bütün sivil toplum kuruluşları, insan hakları örgütleri, siyasetçiler ve gazeteciler Doğu Türkistan'a gidelim.
If everything is all nice and everything, no problem in that part of the world, then
let's ask China to open all doors so that all politicians, human rights organizations and academicians and journalists can visit that part of the world freely.
Bu iddiaları, insan hakları ihlalleri iddialarını ve bütün iddiaları, kampları, dillerin kaldırılmasını, dinlerin ortadan kaldırılmasını, camilerin kapatılması iddialarını ortadan kaldırsınlar ve biz de bu iddiaların sahiplerinin arkasından koşmayalım.
If China proves that those allegations are false, they are not real, there are no concentration camps, the language and religious values and traditions of the Uyghur people are not violated, then let China fix end those things so that we don't talk bad about China.
Çin bu ihlallerin hepsini yapıyor. Soykırım yapıyor. Oradaki Uygur Türklerinin, Kazak Türklerin, Kırgız Türklerinin dillerini ortadan kaldırıyor. Çünkü dil ulus inşacısıdır.
Unfortunately, China is doing those things and carrying out a genocide against Uyghurs, Kazakh and Kyrgyz people and disallowing, forbidding those people to speak their own languages and yeah.
Türkiye'de devletle hükümet farklı şeylerdir.
In Turkey, state and the government are two different things.
Bugünkü hükümet daha aktif olabilir ama ticari endişelerle maalesef tam olarak görevini yapamamaktadır.
The current government could have been more active, but unfortunately, due to the economic concerns, is not able to do what it has to do as expected.
Eğer muhalefet olmasaydı, bizim aktif çalışmalarımız olmasaydı, Türkiye'deki Uygur Türkleri de veya Türkiye üzerinden batıya giden Uygur Türkleri de bugünkü rahat ortamlarına çok kavuşamazlardı gibi geliyor.
Without the activities of the opposition in Turkey, probably Uyghurs in Turkey could not have been so comfortable and maybe they would not be able to use Turkey as a stepping stone, maybe go from Turkey to other countries.
Ve sözlerimi şöyle toparlıyorum. Türk hükümeti, Türkiye yöneten hükümet daha cesur olmalı. Çünkü Uygur Türkleri bizim soydaşlarımız. Çünkü biz atayurdumuz orası, Doğu Türkistan bizim atayurdumuz, Kaşgar, Kaşgarlı Mahmut, Kutatgubililer veya Divan-ı Ligatü Türkler bizim bir noktada en temel kaynaklarımızın doğduğu yerler.
My final suggestion to the current government is that they need to be more active and this is because Uyghurs and the other Turkic peoples living in East Turkestan are our brothers and sisters. We regard East Turkestan as our motherland, homeland, because we have a lot of commonalities with the people in that part of the world.
Son kez Çin'e sesleniyoruz. Bütün dünyada yaptıklarınızı biliyoruz.
Now, finally, I would like to call on China. We know what you are doing in the world.
İnsan hakları ihlallerinizi, tehditlerinizi, hatta bir noktada ölümlerle tehdit ettiklerinizi de biliyoruz.
We know the human rights abuses carried out by China and oppression and threatenings carried out to other people or organizations.
Hiçbir diktatör uzun süre ayakta kalamaz. Hiçbir otoriter rejim uzun süre ayakta kalamaz. Kalmadı zaten tarih boyunca.
No dictator or dictatorship can live to the end, and so far in the history it has been proven.
Buradaki heyeti Çin'e davet etsin. Madem ki hiçbir şey yoksa Çin'de beraberce hep beraber gidelim. Çeşitli ülkelerin insanları var burada, siyasetçiler, akademisyenler var.
if there is nothing happening in East Turkestan, then I am calling on China to allow all those people here to go to East Turkestan and see what is happening. There are academicians and politicians here. Let China allow us to have a visit, a free visit in East Turkestan.
Son söz, epilog yapayım. Nasıl ki Komünist Rusya, Sovyet Sosyalist Cumhuriyetler Birliği yıkıldı ve özgürlükler başladıysa, Çin de bir gün mutlaka yıkılacak ve mutlaka orada bir Doğu Türkistan'da yeniden bir devlet kurulacak.
As Soviet Union has disintegrated, one day China will also disintegrate. A free and independent Turkestan, East Turkestan, will be created in that part of the world.
Türkiye daha cesur olmalı, İslam dünyası daha cesur olmalı, hür Batı dünyası daha cesur olmalı. Özellikle insan hakları komisyonları, komiteleri daha cesur olmalı ki yaşanabilir bir dünya inşa edelim. Teşekkür ediyorum.
Turkey, as well as the Muslim world, as well as the Western world, need to be more courageous and so that together with the human rights organizations and the governments, so that all together we can create a more livable world.
Kendi ülkemde uzun yıllar hapishanede kaldım. 7 sene 12 Eylül bir darbede, ihtilal döneminde kaldım hapishanelerde.
I was in prison for 7 years during the coup on 12 September 1980.
Her şey insan hakları içindi. Her şey milletlere istiklal, insanlara özgürlük içindi.
It was all because of human rights. It was all because for freedom of the humans as well as the freedom of the countries and the states.
Thank you, Mr. Özak. Thank you, all panelists. I would now like to open it up to the floor. We have about 15 minutes left. So I'm actually going to come with some very specific questions if each of you wants to chime in. You know, we've heard how important individual stories are. They're important for policymakers, they're important for journalists, they're important for law enforcement, they're important for academics, they're important for all of us when we talk about transnational repression. So when you take the floor, and I hope many of you will do, I think we'd be really keen to hear in a very short form what your experiences with transnational repression are, or alternatively, how your country has or has not responded to those individual cases on their territory. So with that, I'm going to open it up to the floor.
Microphone.
There, it's coming, yes.
Hi, I'm Scott Busby, formerly of the Human Rights Bureau in the Department of State in the United States, and where we did do lots of work on transnational repression. I can't overestimate for all of you how much traction the issue of transnational repression both gets with other governments and within governments. The very first joint statement done on China at the Human Rights Council in 2016 included lots of language about the extraterritorial actions of the PRC. And the U.S. led that statement, and we specifically felt that condemning these extraterritorial actions would get greater traction with potential signatories than simply talking about the abuses inside of China. We did succeed in getting 12 signatories. We at that time didn't have the time or the ability to expand, but since then these joint statements have gotten 60 co-signatories. So we didn't call the issue transnational repression then, but we did feel that by highlighting these extraterritorial actions, it was harder for governments to object to joining such a statement. Similarly, within the U.S. government, this issue has gotten greater attention from senior U.S. governmental officials than just about any other human rights issue or issue of repression inside of China. Yes, President Biden, Secretary Blinken have spoken about the genocide and other issues. But transnational repression, as Azim said and David also alluded to, involves a violation of state sovereignty. And protection of state sovereignty is a fundamental duty of any government officials. So in your own advocacy within your governments, in your countries, I would urge you to highlight this issue as a way of showing both officials and the citizens of your countries what the nature of the regime is in the PRC and what it has meant both for Uyghurs and others outside of China as well as Uyghurs within China. So just some experiences I had over the course of my time. I would secondly note the U.S., as many of you probably know, now in our annual human rights reports on every country in the world, has a section specifically devoted to the issue of transnational repression. We have struggled, Azim, with how to define it. The definition, I don't even remember what it is. It's narrower than what you were suggesting there. But the United States government welcomes information about these events so that we can capture it in those reports, which lots of people, governments and others, continue to look to. So I would urge all of you, as you encounter incidents of transnational repression, to make sure those are getting reported to the U.S. Embassy in your country or to Washington. Last, I would mention, and Laura herself has participated in some of these, the U.S. government has been doing road shows on how the U.S. government has sought to address the phenomenon of transnational repression inside the United States. State Department officials, Department of Justice officials, Department of Homeland Security officials, and the FBI have gone to various countries, including Japan, to talk about what our own experiences have been. So that's just for your awareness, but if you feel your country needs more of that type of thing, again, I would urge you to be in touch with the U.S. government and request that type of roadshow in your country. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Scott. Anybody else has experiences to share? Yes, please. If you could please also state your name in the beginning. Thanks.
I actually just had a question for Mr. Ibrahim. You've mentioned that transnational repression isn't illegal under the law, and I've seen that transnational repression and foreign interference have been used kind of interchangeably. So I guess my question has two parts to it. First is, what is the difference between transnational repression and foreign interference? And if they're kind of the same thing, does that mean that if transnational repression isn't illegal, then foreign interference is also not illegal under the law? Because the principle of sovereignty is a fundamental principle under the international law, so I just wanted some clarifications on that.
Yeah. So transnational repression isn't illegal as a concept, simply because it's not been defined. As I said, individual violations are well known and may constitute rights violations and may constitute criminal activity. Now the difference is with the interference. Interference in the operation of a democratic system is a very fine line, and many governments are actually quite willing to obfuscate that line and confuse, and they will essentially just say, well, look, this is legitimate lobbying. Yes, the CCP got a little bit aggressive, it got a little bit enthusiastic, but this is legitimate lobbying. And the reason why is simply because they are unable and unwilling to take any sort of concrete action against this kind of interference. And I think Canada, where you're from, is probably the prime example of this. You know, Canada is probably, for all the countries in the West, that's probably the most compromised to CCP influence. You know, you just have to look at the most recent news in terms of the kind of influence and the operation that the CCP operates within Canada. You know, is extremely, extremely aggressive. And so you know, the Canadian government they took their eye off the ball. They simply had, you know, explicitly or implicitly, the reality is that they literally just took their eye off the ball, and now it's become a situation that's just completely out of control in Canada. And so it's a very fine line. None of these things are actually are clear cut and defined, and the confusion is actually there on purpose.
Yeah, briefly I'll comment, Kuzer, as well. One of the things that's not illegal according to international law is China's key tactic of transnational repression, which is family separation and threats to family in East Turkestan. That doesn't transgress international law. So that's how I distinguish transnational repression from interference. Interference clearly does violate sovereignty. If you threaten a Uyghur in the United Kingdom, that breaks our criminal law. That can be prosecuted very easily, but we cannot prosecute family separation. But that is the key tactic of China's transnational repression, so that's what we need to address.
Thank you. Senator Fisher.
Thank you so much for this extremely important panel, and thank you also for our friends and colleagues from Turkey. Most of all for Selçuk Özdak words. I think that this is for us very important to see that in Turkey we have a partner and a close ally as we speak about this very sensitive issue of Chinese interference. Thank you very much for your words. Just allow me to share with you an example of interference which goes beyond any imagination I could have, because it touches the work of the parliament. And I think that today parliaments are expression of sovereignty in which we have still the room to maneuver and to speak out, because we have immunity and we have our constituency, and if we succeed to explain to our constituency what is ongoing, the people simply follow. And I think that with China-related issues, it is of utmost importance, because our governments sometimes have hands somehow limited to move. And I will give you one example of the years, of past years. Our President of the Senate, or Speaker of the Senate, passed away in circumstances which were related to Chinese interference. Maybe directly, maybe indirectly. I stay this very open here, but he was provoking Chinese leadership by proposing and publicly speaking about a project of visiting both Communist China and Taiwan. So he wanted to be someone who, as official in his visits, visit both sides of the Taiwanese Strait. He passed away, and only later on we discover very special circumstances, because by provoking the reaction of the regime, he still had his door wide open for visitors, including the ambassador of People's Republic of China. But he was under high pressure of Chinese leadership. He had even very briefly before he passed away, private meeting with the ambassador without any third person. And he was very heavy smoker, so maybe they had a good time with tobacco we ignore. But only later on, his wife discovers in his documents a letter threatening him that if he goes on with his plans, the impact on the enterprises of our country or on the economic wealth would be direct. And there was also a list of names of enterprises to be targeted. And this letter was signed by officials at the Chinese embassy in Prague, and it was on the letter of the embassy. So it was very puzzling as diplomatic male habitude. And He passed away, he was buried, but no autopsy was organized, even though he was number 2 of the state. And his wife is until now convinced that it was linked with this plan of him to visit both mainland China and Taiwan. When his successor was about to be elected, we challenged him publicly before the election that he should disclose his plans as far as the agenda of his predecessor is concerned, particularly the program or the project of the visit to Taiwan. So we forced him to declare that he will honor this plan. He did, and because of this very high pressure of China, we could speak about, and which was published and followed by media, me with my committee and with my colleagues in the Senate, we succeeded to make a vote and to submit to the vote a resolution pushing and inviting our new president to continue with this plan. So in these circumstances, we succeeded to modify the direct meddling into internal affairs of our country to create a political energy of self-defense and self-protection. And I think that this is a lessons learned which is very hard to transmit, but ourselves, we are amazed how huge energy it created that people followed the plans for our visit to Taiwan, which we succeeded to organize with a greatest attention ever. So I think that first, lessons learned or conclusion is that our countries, regardless the distance from Beijing, are all concerned. Second, that parliaments can transform this intrusion and this energy into something positive while protecting our own sovereignty. And three, that we have not to stop here but continue, because the huge pressure of business people and people who try to relativize this experience or this plans of China to dominate and control even what is ongoing in our constituencies or in our institutions, constitutional institutions, is huge. And I think that this panel also helped us to focus more. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Mr. Chinisli, and then Mr. Shahid.
Just 2 sentences for contribution to your remarks. 2 years ago, the Chinese ambassador, again, I cannot say criticize, he has insulted our chairwoman because she has criticized the president of PRC at the parliament, which was very normal. And unfortunately, our government did not give a right and enough hard answer to the ambassador, which we have expected them. That was my contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I quite like the securitization framing that you have given to this issue. In my own personal experience, I've faced myself what can be called Beijing-linked efforts to repress my work, I suppose, including indicating to me that I could be kidnapped for the work I was planning to do. But I want to shift the frame to something else. We are talking about states in which I think corruption is not an issue, but I doubt that such a state exists. So we're looking at possibly the Chinese authorities monitoring people and then, instilling fear in them. Now, and also looking at how state authorities, the police may not have the legal tools to address this. That's where, that's why we think that if we report this, there wouldn't be a legal frame to respond. But there are also many situations in which corruption is part of this process. That what a foreign embassy does in a third country is not simply follow the different rules, but they also use underhand methods, and they buy out people, co-opt people, and they're part of this apparatus. Now, I come from the Maldives, and that is quite a common thing there, and I doubt if that is uncommon elsewhere also. And also in terms of mobilizing people, yes, I do get the idea that framing something as a security threat will definitely attract the attention of the security apparatus, also of the people. But I do think also looking at the corruption that goes with this could also ignite a whole layer of other people who would be concerned about this process. Certainly in my country, the Maldives, whichever country is trying to influence public opinion and certain actors does both the formal political stuff, the formal foreign aid, and also the much bigger informal other aid that goes people's pockets. And this possibly creates an emotive link with the people and what they're seeing happening to people in the country. In my time in the Maldives, going long time back, I tried to bring out of Guantanamo Bay some Uyghurs who've been taken there by error, of course. And then I couldn't do it because of the money I was required to pay parliamentarians to get that passed through. Somebody else was paying them money. And beyond that, we got very clear indication that we would suffer consequences for doing that. So there is both the official security dimension, but also the corruption that goes beneath it in terms of could be not just money, but other ways of rewarding people's careers or whatever else, that also undermine the capacity of the state to protect foreign nationals in their borders. Just thought if you had done any work on this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed, for that. I would just like to make a very quick point. The senator made a very important point that all countries are now concerned with the CCP influence, and I'm absolutely delighted that your country could protect its sovereignty. But this isn't a luxury that's available to all countries. The reality is that there's only been one study done on this, and that was by the Kiel Institute of Global Economics. They examined 100 publicly available contracts of the Belt and Road Initiative, and they found that within those contracts there were clauses that's clearly stated that a country cannot change its foreign policy position in respect to China unless those loans will be recalled. So each of these countries that have taken loans from China are essentially have become client states of China. And we've seen this as an example, if you remember the letter that was signed by mostly European and Western democracies calling out the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs. Literally it was a matter of days, China produced its own letter signed by how many Muslim countries, almost all of them. And that is essentially why, is because each of these states are now become client states of China. They've taken money from China. And in terms of your point of corruption, within the Belt and Road framework, corruption is actually encouraged. And from their point of view, you have to understand from the point of view of a leader of a developing or a poor and developing country, is that look, we will come in, we'll build your infrastructure, we'll build your roads, airports, highways, ports, everything else, and the people will see it, they will give you credit for it, and why don't you take a couple of $100 million for yourself quietly? And that is encouraged, and the reason why it's encouraged is because obviously you're more likely to sign the contract, and secondly, it's more likely that you will now stay in power, because the next guy that comes in is now going to pursue you for corruption. So China now has a lifelong supporter in power. So corruption is actually built into the model of the Chinese investment. And this is now, there's a lot of discussion about Taiwan, invasion of Taiwan. I don't think there's going to be any invasion of Taiwan. My personal position is that we'll come to a point when there will be just a massive economic blockade of Taiwan, simply by the countries that China controls. And the economic blockade, Taiwan has 11 days of fuel left. Within 11 days, there'll be absolute chaos. And the model for this is Hong Kong. If you remember what was happening in Hong Kong, there was plenty of discussion. When are the CCP troops going to come in? When is there going to be another Tiananmen Square? Not a single CCP troop was on the ground. Not a single shot was fired. They took over Hong Kong, and without anybody basically batting an eyelid. And what could the West and the United States do? Absolutely nothing. This is the model they'll follow. They'll weaponize the countries that they control, economic blockade, chaos within Taiwan, running out of fuel. The United States can do nothing because nobody's actually been killed. And then eventually the voices will be elevated that say, look, we need to come to some sort of accommodation with Beijing. And those voices within the KMT will be elevated, and eventually a deal will be signed. Beijing will step in and bail them out. And everybody around the whole world will breathe a sigh of relief. Thank God we've avoided war between two nuclear powers. And then obviously everyone will be happy, but all those voices that spoke out in Taiwan will be quietly disappeared, but nobody will really pay too much attention to them because we've avoided war. Why would you attack a fort front on, you know, the full amphibious assault when you can go through the sewers and get exactly what you want. And essentially, this entire economic model of the Belt and Road is based on that, the weaponization of global economics against their adversaries.
Thank you for the question about corruption. Yeah, I mean, I would go further than Azim. The co-option is absolutely central to the Chinese party state of the way it does business, not just with the outside world, but with itself. I used to interview cadres, I used to read the books they read on the great revival of the Chinese people, these big grand political concepts, but that is not what they believe, that's not what they're working on. Cadres don't, middle class people don't move to Xinjiang to start up a business or to go into politics because they believe in the great revival of the China dream. They're offered benefits, a home, a decent life, a career. That's just how it works. You see this in forced labour adverts. Yes, the whole system is entirely political, ideological and genocidal, but the adverts for Uyghur labour are directed at ordinary Chinese business people on the other side of the country that just want to make money. That's how it works. And people inside the system know this. They know how to play it. They use the language of the leader. They know how to use these terms to get what they want. They just keep their mouth shut. And that's what we see in the way transnational repression works as well. And even in terms of creation of knowledge in general about China, about the party state, about the system, this is how it works. Academics don't need to be threatened or even offered lots of money. They just know if you say certain things like what I've said today, you will no longer have visa access. You will then be told you do not understand China because you've not been there since 2017. So it shapes not just transnational repression, but our entire knowledge of China. And in terms of in more serious issues, or more serious immediate issues, we saw significant corruption in Kazakhstan where police were arresting people, arresting Uyghurs for a long time, telling us we're doing this for China, there's nothing you can do. We found this in our research in other places. But of course now that's become official policy in Kazakhstan. And that's how it works. It works underhand first, and now Kazakhstan has a policy of working with China so closely that that very corruption itself is now legal. It's allowed.
Thank you. So we'll have two last questions before we go into coffee break. Okay, I see three. So really short, and because then we got a break, but we can continue this conversation afterwards, of course. Sophie, please.
Thanks for a great panel. Maybe this is more of an observation, but if people want to react to it, I'd be interested in your thoughts. In the discussion about how to define the term transnational repression, I think maybe all I want to say is that I hope that in this conversation we don't lose or put down or walk away from the opportunity to talk about actual criminal conduct. And I think as a matter of educating publics and mobilizing political support, that talking about the number of instances of Chinese government harassment, stalking, insert the crime of your choice, that take place on an annual basis, I think it's a very powerful way of making the point. Obviously, there are a lot of other aspects of this phenomenon that aren't explicitly criminalized, and I think that's a very complicated discussion around some issues about free speech, for example. But I think speaking in the language of actual crimes and legal enforcement can be very powerfully motivating, particularly when other communities or people in communities that are affected see what they consider to be a positive law enforcement response. I think that can actually help bring more people into the discussion and feel confident in reporting. So,
thanks for that comment, Sophie. And I think that's also one of the reasons it's so important that within the communities, people do talk not only about their personal experiences, but also what the response from their government has been. Because I know a lot of these people in this room are probably very frustrated with the response they've gotten. But at the same time, I can tell you, and I won't look at anyone, but like the response you've gotten is probably a lot better than what maybe your colleagues have gotten in country Y, for example. So sharing those practices, sharing those experiences is really important because you're building up the resilience from the community, and you can actually help law enforcement in other countries build up better responses. So thank you for that point.
Hi. I would like to share my experience over here, even though we are focusing on Uyghur. In terms of transnational aggression, I thought that I would share how Tibetans in India are facing transnational aggression, especially more severely with the Tibetans who were born in Tibet and now residing in India. I think earlier when we also had a transnational aggression discussion, people were saying that we should report and keep a record. But within the Tibetans who were born in Tibet and living in India, I mean, the issues that we raised over here has become very normal. Has become very normal in our life. So with my friends and not being able to see your family for like 20 years, 30 years is everyone's story for the Tibetans in India. But we never thought that this is something that we should be raised at the big platforms. So one thing is that so many of the young Tibetans who were residing in India and not being able to see their family for like 20, 30 years. So nowadays, the one tactic or intimidation or tactic that the Chinese government they do in India is that they say that we allow Tibetans from India to go back to Tibet and visit your family, and so they would open, people to apply for visit kind of visa. So with that hope, what I realize is that many of my friends, they don't go and attend protests because hoping that maybe I will get a visa to visit my family. With case of my brother, since 1991, he had been applying for that visa to visit family. But I think I would say maybe 15 to 20 times, but they would not issue the visa. But in that process, many people, they are scared to go to the protests because, especially in India, it's very common that at the protest, the Chinese guy would come at the protest and take your pictures. And so that's a huge, I think, issue that we see in the Tibetans, especially young Tibetans who were born in Tibet. And I personally don't know what the international community can do this or what the Tibetan community can do this, but I don't know whether there is any solution in that. But just to say that we felt that this is the life of exiled communities, so there is nothing to be done on that, and so everyone has accepted that this is our life, and so yeah, I just wanted to share that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I think one of the most important things is exactly that, sharing it, so that the wider international community becomes aware, and that hopefully we can devise some solutions, some responses, although I also think we're all very conscious that some things may be outside our power. But thank you again for sharing that. I think that's the most important first step, so that other people become aware, and so that for sure we all remember and we all know that no, this is not normal. This is not supposed to be normal, and this is not acceptable. So thank you again. And with that, we go to the last comment in the front row, and then we'll go into coffee break. Oh, okay, I see a lot more comments.
A small one. Okay, I know we don't have a lot of time. Just thank you, everybody, for this incredible panel. David, you jump on what I said yesterday about MPs. In our riding, we have to make sure that people in the riding are supporting us with certain issue and make it possible to bring it in our parliaments. Because if they don't support us, we won't be elected and we won't be in parliament to bring those issues. The thing is, and we're talking about transnational, the thing is, CCP are aware about that. We are talking that they have effect on global economics, but sometimes they are targeting small businesses that you don't know, that nobody knows about here, but the small businesses, for example, in my riding, who are exporting in China, would be targeting. And CCP will make sure that they know why they'll be targeting, because their representative in the House will be a champion. So they target a champion of human rights in Western parliaments all around the world to make sure they're not going to be elected anymore. And that's just a comment, but we have to be careful about it, because we're going to lose a lot of champions in a lot of parliaments around the world. And that's a point that sadly we don't think about sometimes, but it's very important if we want to continue work for human rights causes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mehmet Bey, siz İngilizceye tercüme edersiniz. Ben Uygurca sualımdı. Bu yerde bugün hakikaten mühim bir meseleni tartışıp durdunuz. Hem nemdegen açık bir ahval bu. Yani Şarkı Türkistan'da bugün ırkı kırgınçılık buluvatıdı. Biz Şarkı Türkistan'ın içideki, Xitayning içideki meselelerge merkezleşişimiz gerek iken, bugün Xitayning chet ellerde elip berivatkan Şarkı Türkistanlık ve başka muhalif güçlerge kılıvatkan tehditini kandak kılımız degen meselelerde kandak tehdit kılıvatıdı degen meseleler üstüde toxtuluvatımız. Bu yerdeki mühim boğan nerse, biraz evvel Sayın Vekilim Selçuk Özdağ Bey bu konuya değindi. Kandak kılışımız gerek yani. Kandak kılımız. Biz dünya cemaatçiliki, halkara, Birleşken Devletler Teşkilatı veya ki sivil toplum kuruluşları bu şunçilik aciz mi? Yani Xitayninki kılıvatkan bu zulümlerini toxtutuşka bir güçümüz yetmemdi. Nima uchun bu davam qiladi? Hozir irqiy qirg'inchilikni to'xtatishni qo'yib turib, biz boshqa ishlarga markazlashyapmiz. Bu Xitoyninki o'zining bizning markaziy nuqtamizni burib o'tishninki bir vositasi deyalaymiz. Yana birisi biz biraz zulmga bağışıklık qozongan bir ahvolda turibdimiz. Başka nurgun milletler zulüm dep qaragan narsalarni artık Uygurlar bek zulüm dep qarmaydigan bir normal bir hayatının bir parçasıga aylanıp qıldık. Müşadiki nurgun qarindaşlarımız başta 40 yıl, 30 yıl, 20 yıl ailesi bilen görüş bakmagan, alaqılış bakmagan 7-8 yıl bolgan nurgun arkadaş dostlarımız var. Müşlarınki hemmisi oturdu. Bunu kandak bir taraf kılımız. Bunu hal kılışın yolu qaysi? Bu mesele üstünden biraz başka tursak texim paylık bulan diken dep oylayım. Rahmet. Today we have been talking about a very significant but at the same time very heartbreaking issue. At the moment, genocide is taking place in China. But we are focusing on things that is happening not inside China, but things happening outside of China. Mr. Selçuk also mentioned a while ago, we should be focusing mainly on what we should do, a plan, a strategy, a recipe for treatment of the problem. I am wondering whether the world, the free world, the whole world, Islamic world and all that, everybody, are we like weak? Are we not able to provide a solution to this important problem? while we are looking at little things, small things, unfortunately, as Uyghurs, we have kind of became immunized to oppression because we have been going through this issue for many, many years, and it's kind of, we have become immunized, and it kind of became normal. There are many of us in this room who have not been able to visit their families at all since they left the country maybe 20 or 30 years ago. So my opinion is that we should be mainly focusing on strategies, ways of improving and finally solving this problem.
Thank you. And with that, Zumurtai is looking at me quite angrily. There's coffee in the next room, so obviously please do continue this conversation during coffee break, rest of the day, and in the coming days, weeks, months, and years to come. Thank you.